Sanbonani and welcome to Rising of Alkepulani. Rising of Alkepulani is a social media platform that aims to restore Africans back to their spirituality through social media. On today's topic, we'll be focusing on the issue of African temples. The question is, did Africa have temples? It is important for us to know and understand that Africa has a great history. Again, as much as Africa has a great history, it is important for us to know and understand that majority of the history of Africans was wiped away from us. Our history was wiped away. During the dark ages that many people know, that's where the truth and the history of Africans was wiped away, or rather hidden, because some of the knowledge is still there but it's hidden. So today we'll be focusing on the African temples. Did Africa have temples? If we can take a look today, in 4 corners of the world, there are temples, there are institutions everywhere. A majority of them are religious institutions. Every nation, or rather every religion, has their own temples, they have their own institutions. We have churches, we have synagogues, we have different temples. Muslims have their temples, Arabs have their temples, and then again Christians have their own temples. But now the question is, did Africa have temples? People today have this patriarchy and knowledge that Africans, we didn't have temples of our own, which is not right. We did have temples. Africa did have temples. Today people have this logic and this understanding that Africans used to worship near the rivers, on trees, on mountains. And now today when we are being asked about our own African temples, we point people to mountains, we point people to rivers, we point people to places that are not well represented. It is true, of course, there were spiritual activities that we did in those places. We did have spiritual activities in rivers. We did have spiritual activities in mountains. We did have spiritual activities under the trees. But that doesn't mean those were our temples or those were our institutions. And today it's even very hard to point the African institution or African temples, because you see people, if you point a river, where that's not an institution, a river is a river. So majority of scholars or the logic of the world, people think that no, Africa didn't have temples. Why? Because there are no buildings or there are no proper structures that actually define that those are African temples. As I'm saying, we have your rivers, we have your mountains, we have your trees. Those are natural entities that are there, but they don't define African temples. They don't define African institutions. Let's take a look at other religions. Muslims have their own temples. Today we have synagogues. You see how beautiful synagogues are. We have churches. You see how well structured churches are. If you go there, they have their own, they are the institution. They run it according to their own religion, according to their own belief. It is a well-structured institution. It is a well-structured thing that they are doing for them and for their religion. And everything that they do there revolves around their religion. So it's easier for them to point out that no, this synagogue is an institution maybe for Muslims or for Arabs. Christians have churches. If you can go majority in South Africa to your Sentin, there are many churches there. A Christian can point out that this is our institution, this is our temple. As Christians, we do own churches, and of course they are well structured. They are an institution. Why? Because they are proper, they are well structured. They don't point rivers, they don't point mountains, they don't point trees. But when you come to Africa, people can't believe, or they don't understand when we point rivers or something like that. It really doesn't make sense. So today you are dealing with that topic that as Africans, we did have African temples. We did have our own temples that were well structured and well governed by the spirit kings. It is true that we did have spirit kings, and our temples were under the leadership of the spirit kings, not traditional kings but spirit kings. In ancient Mesopotamia, there is a history that there were temples of Africa. There were spirit kings that were ruling, that had institutions, that had African temples, where spirituality was ruling. Everything that they were doing was spiritual. Again, let's come to Africa. In ancient Egypt, we do have step pyramids. We do have pyramids, step pyramids that were under the rulership of the spirit kings that were known as priests. According to scholars, they call them the priests, but they were spirit kings. Of course, under the traditional rulership of the pharaohs. Those were African temples. But what happened to them? the religious institutions or the religious temples, your synagogues, your churches, they are still operational today. They are still working today. But what about the African temples that I'm mentioning, including your ancient Mesopotamia? We did have African temples. In Egypt, we have still pyramids, we have pyramids. Today, it's a pity that those places are not treated as museums because they are no longer operational. There's no longer spirituality in there. There's no longer Africanism in there. The great deities that were working there, the spirit kings that were running those institutions, it's like they are dead now. Because now people go to them as tourist attractions. Nothing is happening there. Those were African temples. The deities were speaking there. The spirit kings were receiving spiritual principles, spiritual revelations in those temples. Just like the religious temples, they claim that they receive spiritual rulership, they receive spiritual guidance, they receive spiritual principles, of which that's a lie because they are religious, they are just receiving religious texts, they're just receiving religious principles and religious rules. But even today, they are still operational. They are still working up to this day. But our own African temples that we have no knowledge about, they are not working. They are just they are treated as museums. So now the question is, in South Africa, in Africa as a whole, we see different temples, your synagogues, your churches. Every religion in Africa, they have their own temples. They have their own institutions. We all know the only reason was colonialism. It was for them to colonize us. The reason why, and to check this, they built their temples and they destroyed African temples. They made sure that they sideline and they hide African temples in order to bring up or to praise their kingdom, to uplift their own institutions. Today we can see in Africa as a whole, Islam is dominant, Christianity is dominant, particularly every religion is dominant. Every religion they have their own temples, and who will you find in those temples? African people. We are the ones who are in those temples. And now the question will be, where are our own African temples? We did have our own African. Why won't we go to our own African temples? Now again, another question would be, where are the African temples? As I mentioned, they are museums today. They are tourist attractions today. They are no longer operational. It is our own responsibility. It is our own activity to find the current spirit king, to find the current African temple that is operational, where spirituality exists. Don't tell us about African churches or the AIS. They are mixing Christianity and African tradition. It's not even spirituality, it's tradition. They are mixing African tradition and Christianity or other religions. So we can't take African churches. We all know them. You can't take those churches that we say that no, at least they are practicing Africanism, and then we say they are our own institutions. No, they are not. As a matter of fact, some of them are even practicing those things in sheikhs. So we can't point a sheikh and say this is an African institution. And that's why other religions, they look down on us as Africans, because they are like, you guys don't have your own temples. Look at our own synagogues. Look at our own institutions. Look at our own temples. Look at our own churches. And we go there because we lack knowledge and we don't know where our own African temples. So the reason why we have those temples here, and there are too many here in Africa, is because of colonialism. They were here to colonize us. They were here to uplift their own temples. It's all about colonialism. And now we live in a current era. This has to do with the war of gods. We live in a current era now. It's really not understandable. Why will you find an African on a Muslim institution? Or why will you find an African on a synagogue? Well, we live in a free country. We're in a democracy. It's a free will. But, and again, it's not racism or what. We all have a right to choose which way to follow. But does it make sense for an African to be in a synagogue and worship foreign gods? While at least there are African temples. We have our own God. We have our own deities. Is it a right thing for an African to worship a foreign God? Right now, there are uprising news. South Africa versus Israel. So now let's make a scenario. If South Africa can fight with Israel, which way will you fall under, or which side will you take? Will you stand with South Africa or will you stand with Israel? If you stand with South Africa, well, you will disappoint the God of Israel. You won't mention, but you will disappoint the God of Israel. Why? Because you pray under the God of Israel. So now, if you side with South Africa, what about your religion? What about the religion that you follow? What about the God of Israel that you follow? And again, if you side with Israel, it means you are a traitor. You betray your own blood. You choose to side with Israel rather than South Africa. So you see that the whole thing leads to confusion and betrayal. We do have our own African deities. We should stand firm to our own African deities. We do have our own African temples. And again, in this common era, in this era that we live in now, the only institution, one of the most that we know, it's the Revelation Spiritual Home. It is an African indigenous spiritual institution that is active in the current era under the leadership of Inkosi Yamakhosi, the Spirit King uZulezwe Radebe. It is an active African indigenous spirituality institution. It is the institution that we have today, and this institution will uplift those hidden institutions. It will uplift those institutions that were dead, that were brought down by the foreign religions. Yes, I'm talking about you step pyramids from Egypt. I'm talking about the pyramids from Egypt, the ancient African temples that we had in ancient Egypt, the ancient African temples that we had in Mesopotamia. The Revelation Spiritual Home will give rise to those institutions, because this institution, it is the current institution that is active, where spiritual revelation, spiritual principles are being revealed. The Revelation Spiritual Home is indeed the current spiritual temple that is here to restore the African temples that were destroyed, to restore Africans back to their own spirituality. It is the current and the most active African indigenous spirituality that we can point. The Revelation Spiritual Home has more than 90-odd spiritual centers, which we can point that these are the African indigenous spiritual temples. African temples must have dignity. They must have a well-structured way of rulership and guidance. And the Revelation Spiritual Home is perfect for that. It's suitable for that, because we see that it's active and it's doing that in our era that we live in. In conclusion, in Africa, we did have African indigenous spiritual temples, and we continue to have African indigenous spiritual temples. As I mentioned currently, it is the Revelation Spiritual Home. So let's all refrain from the information or from the knowledge that we don't have African indigenous spiritual temples. The rivers, the mountains, the trees, those are the spiritual places where some of the African indigenous spiritual activities need you to be there. They are not African temples. A river cannot be a temple, cannot be an institution. And again, this is one of the things that confuses a lot of people, because they have this thing of saying, no, as Africans we don't need buildings. We are the children of nature. Therefore, trees, rivers, and mountains, they are not. Some of the spiritual activities, they need you to be there. Not that those are our own. They are our own temples. Those are not temples. Those are just spiritual places where some of the spiritual activities must be practiced, because those places have high spiritual frequency. But we did have our own African indigenous temples. We did have our own institutions that were well structured, that were well guided.